So I'm anticipating in advance that there's going to be kind of a separate viewership of these next two videos that are only interested in seeing the stuff that I have to say about Marx's reproduction schema, and that's fine. If you're one of these people, then I would encourage skipping ahead to about 30 minutes in. If you look at the video description, there should be a chapter title that is reasonably where you'd want to start. For the people that are watching, that have been watching the other videos, you should keep watching, because I spent some time basically transitioning from what I said before into that. But if you're one of the people that's only here to see that part, then you should feel free to skip the first 30 minutes or so of this video. So in the last video, we looked at the circulation of capital kind of in general. We kind of fixed a specific capital of interest, and we kind of analyzed what we could about a single capital flow kind of in a vacuum. In this video, we're going to take the next step forward. If you take all of the capitals, all of the flows of capital, as a totality, then what you get is the capitalist mode of production. And at that point, what you see is that the capitalist mode of production is a circulatory system, sort of like the blood flow in your body is a circulatory system. And in fact, the inspiration for this mode of thinking about an economy comes directly from a bunch of French physicians that called themselves the physiocrats, or maybe they were called the physiocrats, I'm not really sure which. But these physiocrats, led by a guy named, I think you pronounce the name Quenet, I'm not really sure. In his work, again, I'm not sure if you pronounce this exactly, Tableau économique or whatever, it conceptualized the economy as a circulatory system inspired by the human circulatory system, which was being kind of discovered at the time. And one of the big conceptual discoveries about the human body at this time, and the human, and specifically the role of the heart, is that prior to the discovery, a lot of people kind of thought of the heart as something that produced blood, sent it out, it would go to the vital organs and the places where it needed to go, and then it would stop, it would terminate. Whereas the big discovery was that no, it actually doesn't terminate, it comes back in, it circulates, and that the heart is more of a pump. It's something that is creating the force of motion for the blood. The blood is circulating around the heart, it's going through the heart and traveling, and it's in constant motion. And the physiocrats decided to take this and conceptualize an economy around that. And they viewed the pump, the heart, as essentially agriculture. Marx is going to edit this idea, and he's going to replace agriculture as the pump with labor. So let's try to kind of diagram out what we know so far and sort of see that for ourselves. So I've tried to draw this model out in my own way a few times, and I think this is what I'm going to show you here is the version that I came up with that I think kind of looks and feels the best. So I've already drawn what you see in the center, which is the version, the economic version of the heart, which is labor, the pump. This is where all of the stuff is going to come from and then eventually come back to. And then we also have the vital organs, and the vital organs are going to be the two departments that I mentioned. We mentioned that we have sort of a capital goods department or a capital goods industry and a wage goods industry. We have the sector of the economy that is producing the inputs to other commodities, to other industries, the steel and the oil and such. And then we also have the wage or luxury or consumer goods industry, which is what's producing the consumer goods, the end products. And I'm going to kind of view those as two of the three or four vital organs of the capitalist economy, as kind of Marx is conceptualizing it. So I'm going to put the capital goods department over here, and I'm going to denote that just department 1. I'm not going to really write capital goods every time. I'm just going to write department 1. So when I write department 1, I'm referring to capital goods. And then over here we have department 2, which is wage goods. So I'm going to put those on either side. And so what is going to happen is that labor is going to pump into the two departments. So I'm going to denote this L. So labor flows into the two departments. The workers leave their homes and they go to their jobs, and you can kind of think of that as a blood flow to the two departments, the capital goods, the wage goods department. And out of the two departments comes products, right? We get commodities out, and they're going to go somewhere, and so we need to kind of draw where that goes, and I think that it's clear where it goes. It goes to the market. I'm going to have this other organ that's called the market. I'm going to put it right here. And so what's going to happen is that commodities are going to come out of the two departments, and they're going to go into the market. And since you know, just to kind of make sure all the notation that we defined in the last video is in use, I'm going to go ahead and put ... p ... P dot 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 to denote, to make it clear that this is where production is happening. This is the production part of the capital social relation. All of the productive parts of the capital social relation are going on here and here. And they produce products, they produce commodities that go into the market. And so at that point, the market is kind of the crucial organ, because the market is where the stuff changes hands. We've got all of this stuff in the market now, and what we have to do now is we have to distribute it. And so the distribution goes in a few different ways. First of all, obviously, it has to flow back into labor. It has to. So workers are going to go into the market, and they're going to purchase means of subsistence. So the workers go to the market, and they get from the product of the two departments what they need to survive. So the means of subsistence flows in, and that's what powers the labor, right? And then labor power can reproduce itself, and it can distribute itself to the two departments. And so that's the first place that stuff from the market goes, but then it also goes to the two departments. It goes to this department, and it goes to this department. And the stuff that goes to these two departments are means of production, which I'm going to denote MP. So means of production flow out of the market into the two departments, and means of subsistence flows into the pump, the labor producer, where labor power is reproduced essentially. And it flows out in one other way too. It flows out to the capitalist class, which I'll put at the bottom here, because this is kind of a terminal point, and it isn't really a circulatory point even. I'm just going to put capitalist consumption as kind of a bottom organ down here. And what flows here is, I'm just going to say the surplus. Some of the surplus is going to float here. If your economy isn't growing, then all of the surplus is going to flow here. But if your economy is growing, then this model is kind of hard to think about at that point. So this is the economy in sort of real terms, or if you're talking about it with more Marxist language, you'd call this like the kind of use value version of the economy. But there is a dual economy. There is a value form of everything in this whole theory. And so what you really have, in addition to all of these commodities, everything I've drawn here is a flow of commodities, right? We've got labor as a commodity. It's flowing into this department. That produces other commodities that they flow here. And then you know, the commodities change hands and get redistributed, and they go here, here, and here. Everything is commodity flowing here. But then there's also the flow of money. And the flow of money, the interesting thing about it is that it's exactly identical to this, except it goes in reverse, right? Labor is going to flow into Department 1, but what's really happening is that Department 1 is providing money to labor in order to get them to come over here. So you've got this kind of, I'll make these dotted lines for the flow of money. So I made some room. You've got a flow of money. You've got a flow of money from Department 1 into the labor pump, and then that flow of money continues. It goes down here as the workers go and take that money in order to get their means of subsistence. So you've got a reverse flow like that. And then also, you know, Department 1 is bringing its commodities to market, but more specifically, it's selling those commodities at the market. And so there's a flow of money like this. You get a flow of money in you get all of the same arrows just going in the reverse direction. There's nothing really new when you track the money, but you do have a flow of money. So Department 2, you know, goes to the market and they buy stuff, right? Department 2 goes to the workers' houses and they buy their labor power. Department 2 is receiving money for the commodities that they sell to the market, and then likewise, finally, the capitalists are taking their money to market in order to consume. So the dotted lines here are all flows of money. So dot, dot, dot. And so there you have it. What we have here is sort of, I think, a pretty cool and kind of clean presentation of kind of the overall sort of circulation of total capital in the economy. It's sort of only useful if you're thinking about just how capitalism reproduces itself, not necessarily how it grows. You can think of growth as sort of all these lines thickening at once, and that's sort of what we're going to be analyzing with most of this video. But I think what's useful about this diagram in its own right is that you can witness within it a lot of different types of circulation, like whichever kind of you're looking for. And on that note, I think it's important. I think it's at this point I should point out something that I probably should have made more clear already, which is why we're so focused on these two departments. Why we're so focused on partitioning the economy basically in this way, where we're essentially concerned with a capital goods department, which is all of the industries producing the intermediary, like commodities used for the sake of making other commodities, and the second department that is making all the end products. The reason that we're concerned with that is that we've always been concerned with that. If you look at the kind of timeline of the working day that we sort of started with, right, we were always doing this. We had a good chunk of the day that was being spent making the raw materials that you would need in order to continue this process the next day. And then, you know, we had a V and an S part, but it's really this line here that's kind of essential. This line right here. It's not necessarily always in the middle, but this C region, what is this? All of the stuff that's made here, that's happening in the capital goods department. And then everything here, that's the wage goods department, or consumer goods. I kind of prefer the consumer goods as the terminology. But this division between capital goods and consumer goods wasn't something that we just decided to do arbitrarily later. This was always how we were thinking about things. We just didn't give it those names. We hadn't broken up, we hadn't thought at the granular level of the individual industries yet. But we've always been kind of thinking about the working day with this division in mind. It's just now we're looking directly at the industries. And so we have these two departments, the capital goods and the wage goods department. And so what I want to do first, before I really talk about or analyze this thing at all, is I want to draw a simpler version of the diagram. I think this is like kind of a more complete way to look at things. But there's a kind of a simpler version of the diagram to draw if what you're concerned with principally are the interrelations between the departments, which is something that we are going to be very concerned with. So let's draw that. And I apologize for all the boxes popping up and stuff. I might stop using this whiteboard application soon. This update is kind of trash. But anyway, if the only two boxes I'm going to draw in this kind of simplified diagram are the boxes for the two departments. We've got Department 1, that's the capital goods department. And we've also got Department 2. That's the wage goods department, or the consumer goods department, I'd rather say. So from the perspective of just looking at these two departments on their own, we sort of have three circulations. We have two circulations which are kind of intra-departmental, and then one circulation which is interdepartmental. So let's start with the two intra-departmental ones. Department 2 is producing wage and luxury goods. They're producing consumer goods. And those consumer goods are consumed by people. And so to the extent that there are people working in Department 2, the wage goods being produced for them are simply staying within this department. So we have a circulation of wage goods which is simply circulating within the department itself. So we have this circulation here. And so these are the consumer goods consumed by workers and capitalists in Department 2. And so this is a circulation that kind of stays within its own department. We also have a similar circulation with Department 1, but it's not the wage goods, obviously, because Department 1 is producing the capital goods. But to the extent the capital goods are needed by Department 1, and they are, there's lots of capital goods that are needed to make other capital goods, that is a circulation that is also intra-departmental. It happens inside of Department 1. So this is capital goods used for other capital goods, used to make other capital goods. So the capital goods that are used to make other capital goods stay in Department 1. The consumer goods used by consumers and capitalists in Department 2 stays within Department 2. And so then what we have left is simply the circulation between Departments 1 and 2. And so what's going to happen there is that Department 1 is going to be sending capital goods over for use in Department 2. So we've got this circulation. And so this, and finally, Department 2 is sending their wage and luxury goods over to Department 1 to the extent that the workers and capitalists need them there. So this simpler diagram with just Departments 1 and 2 is kind of what we're going to be mostly staring at for a while. And we're sort of going to be leaving the more complicated diagram behind. But I think the more complicated diagram I drew here is pretty cool. And so before we move on from it, I kind of want to show, mostly just because it's kind of fun, where these three circulations between Departments 1 and 2 in the simpler diagram, what they correspond to in the more complicated one. So let's start with the consumer goods industry. And what's interesting too here is that you're going to see that all of these are CMC relationships: commodity, money, commodity. So let's start with the consumer goods that are consumed by the workers and the capitalists and consumed from Department 2, that stays within Department 2. So first of all, they leave Department 2 in the form of commodities. And then those commodities go into the market, and from the market, the capitalists, they're sort of siphoned off by the capitalists in Department 2. But either way, they go into the market as commodities, and then they come back in to Department 2 in the form of money. And then once they've come back to Department 2 in the form of money, then that money is recycled by going to pay for labor power. It is taken to the workers, it is offered to the workers, and then the workers provide their commodity, which is labor power. And so there is the circuit. There is the curve that we drew right here. This red circuit, the circulation of consumer goods and wage goods in Department 2 that stays within Department 2, is this red line that I drew here. And you can see it is commodity, money, commodity. We start with commodities, and then we come back in as money, and then we finish as commodities. Likewise, capital goods used by to make other capital goods. Let's do that one next. That's kind of the simplest one. It comes out of Department 1 in the form of commodities, just like before. You don't have any kind of siphoning off for capitalists because they're capital goods. The capitalists aren't consuming them. So they just go straight back into Department 1 as money, at which point the money is taken back to the market in order to exchange for more capital goods, different capital goods depending on the industry, means of production, to restart the whole process. And again, we see it's a very different looking loop. It's not specifically like symmetric to the other one, as we saw, but it is exactly the same thing. It's a closed loop, and it is specifically a closed loop that is of the form, commodity, commodity, money, commodity, and then it kind of keeps going. And so now we have the fun part, which is the interdepartmental circulation. And this one is significantly more complicated. I'm going to ignore capitalist consumption. I'm only going to think about the working class consumption in order to make this simpler. So let's start with the commodity. Let's start with this one, the capital goods that are used by Department 2. So the capital goods used by Department 2, how does that work out? Well, Department 1 sends out its commodities into the market, and the market does its magic, and Department 2 buys means of production from the market, which came from Department 1. So that's the first C. That's the C, and now we are at the M. And so the M works like this. The M part is where it gets really complicated. So money comes out of Department 2 in order to pay for this. It goes back into the market, and is worked, and through that goes back to Department 1. And so Department 1 receives the money from Department 2 for the means of production. Now, where does that go? What happens to that money? What we have in the circulation right now is money. Where does that money go? That money goes to the workers to pay for their labor power. So it goes to the workers, and how do the workers use that money? The workers are going to buy the means of subsistence from Department 2. And so how does that work? Well, the money goes this way. It goes into the market, and through the market it goes to Department 2. At which point the Department 2 puts out its consumer goods into the market, and that's what the workers take home with them. They take home those consumer goods. Those consumer goods are used to reproduce the workers' labor power, and then the workers' labor power goes into Department 1, and it produces the commodities, at which the thing repeats. I told you this one was a lot more complicated. So this is, but that is it. That's the closed loop. It's a little bit of a mess. You can see that the market is an interesting organ in all of this. The market is like a router. It's kind of just where it just kind of routes all of this stuff. You've got these three circulations that are all kind of tangled up, but they are their own kind of independent closed loops. You've got basically, let's track this. We've got commodity, that's this initial one, that's the capital goods going from Department 1 to Department 2, into money, whoa, it takes a while, and now we're back to commodity at this point. At this point it goes back like that, and then we have the process, and then that's the closed loop. So I think it's kind of cool that this is still like a CMC circuit, even though it's so complicated. So what we're doing right now is we're looking at the capitalist kind of system as like a totality in a simplified way. There's a lot of stuff missing from this, obviously. But, we're kind of just looking at it as a whole, looking at it as a circulatory system. And what we've identified are three kind of circulations of significance that are kind of separate from each other. They're interrelated, but they're also kind of their own separate loops that play fundamental roles in the economy. And what's really interesting is that in each of these three circulations, we can see completely different potential crises and problems and just things going on. And so in order to analyze those, I think I'm going to label these. I'm going to call this circulation, circulation 1, because it's department 1. I'm going to call this circulation, circulation 2, that's department 2, and then I'm going to call the middle one circulation 3. And then I'm going to shift back to the PowerPoint and talk about these three circulations one at a time. Before I jump to the PowerPoint, though, I kind of wanted to connect this to other things we've been talking about and make note that the first circulation, circulation 1, is a good portion of this loop that I drew before. And I mentioned already that this loop had one kind of like stability advantage over the loops that involve consumer goods. And that stability advantage, I said, is that insofar as the capital goods are being used to make other capital goods, they're self-compensating in terms of rising productivity. So you're in less danger there of a crisis of overproduction than you are with the other two loops. And so I wanted to mention that and kind of connect it back there. So we don't see a crisis of overproduction as the potential issue when we look at this first circulation. What we see instead are supply chain problems. So the fundamental distinction between the capital goods and the consumer goods is that the consumer goods are end products. And because they're end products, they're not being fed back into production as an input, or at least they're doing that less. And so because of that, what we see in is concentrated in this first circulation, all of the supply chains that you're always hearing about. To the extent that you have a supply chain, right, this input feeds into this input, feeds into this input, feeds into that, right? We have these long, complicated supply chains, and that's what we see when we look at this circulation. And so all of the problems, of course, that supply chains are liable to have are found within this first circulation. Another thing that you should note, and this is all kind of towards the same point, is that circulation 1 involves a disproportionate amount of fixed capital. Remember, fixed capital is capital that basically lasts for multiple turnover cycles in the production of something else. So I buy a machine, and that machine is capital, but it lasts for multiple turnover cycles in the production of something else. That's the fixed capital, and you can already just kind of hear from me talking about it that way, that you're going to have a disproportionate amount of the fixed capital happening in this first circulation here. Most of the capital in Department 2 is going to be fluid. Most of the capital in Department 1 is going to be, or at least a lot of the capital in Department 1 is going to be fixed. And I mentioned before, one of the reasons why fixed capital is extremely dangerous to the capitalist system as a whole. And there's a lot more ways to kind of note that when you're looking at the circulation as a whole. Fixed capital is characterized by long and varied turnover rates. So you know, because I make a machine and I sell it and it lasts for a long time before somebody replaces it, that's one reason why fixed capital kind of is characterized by long and varied turnover rates. They're going to have varied durations. Some fixed capital is going to last for 1 year, and some fixed capital is going to last for 12 years, right? It's also tends to be expensive. And when I say expensive, what I really mean is that when I buy a machine, I've got to put a lot of money forward immediately. So it requires a large sum of capital advanced. And both of these combined are going to basically incentivize the capitalists of Department 1. They're going to be forced to hoard a lot of their money. They're going to be forced to basically save. In order to kind of deal with these discrepancies, they're going to have to put things aside. They're going to have to put money aside for multiple turnover cycles while they wait to accumulate enough money to purchase the big machine, or wait for the machine, or they might end up waiting a long time for the machine to turn over, right, to be used up by the other people, by other capitalists, so they have to come get it back. In that sense, they're waiting as well. So there's going to be a lot of hoarding as a result of all of these observations combined, a lot of hoarding of capital. And we've seen that hoarding is kind of antithetical to capital. Capital is a flow. Hoarding is a blockage to that flow. From the perspective of capital, hoarding is things staying still. It's a buildup that is not moving. And so this brings us back around to the problem of the supply chains, because if I'm a capitalist and I'm forced to hoard a good amount of my capital at some point, and I am also producing something that is just one link in a broader supply chain, then other capitalists down the line are going to find themselves impatiently waiting for me. They're going to find themselves held up by my hoarding, by my the fact that I'm being forced to save in order to kind of turn around my production. And so this kind of creates a latent potential for disruptions in this circulation. The fact that this circulation is where the supply chains are centralized, and also the fact that this circulation involves a lot of fixed capital with a lot of long turnover rates and a lot of expensive investments that are necessary. At least in the initial stages of capitalist development, these are problems that capitalism is going to have to address as it develops, essentially. What we're identifying here are latent problems intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production at its foundation. That's what we're identifying here. And from that, we can kind of work our way forward in history and understand the present. But that's kind of how I tend to think about it. And so all of this is to say, when I look at this first circulation, what I see is potential crises of the supply chain, potential crises involving the supply chain, which is something we're very familiar with, I think, right now. So those are the things we see when we look at circulation 1. What do we see when we look at circulation 2? I think it's obvious. What we see is that what we've been talking about, which is overproduction and problems of overproduction, which are equivalently problems of underconsumption. But there's a lot of similarities here nonetheless. So there's a few new observations that we can make about this. First of all, what we should note is that there's a difference between circulation 1 and circulation 2, in that circulation 2, this flow relies on continual rational consumption on the part of the working class. The working class is consuming their means of subsistence, but what if they don't spend their wages how we should expect them to? If they're not doing that, then they're going to create issues in this flow. So this flow doesn't depend on rational consumption from the working class, but this class does hinge on what the working class chooses to do when they go home and spend their money, and that's significant. So whatever the means of subsistence is, they're expected to go and use their wages to buy that and consume that and nothing else. If they don't do this, then that could cause problems. So on a related note, just as circulation 2 has a hoarding problem on the part of the capitalists, circulation 1 has a hoarding problem on the part of the workers. In particular, any saving on the part of the workers in either department can disrupt the flow of capital from department 2. So if workers choose to save their money, then that's essentially the same issue as the capitalist hoarding their money in department 1. If the workers are saving their money rather than spending it, then that is going to cause problems in this overall circulation, because they need to buy the stuff for that capital to turn over. And so if they're saving money, that's a problem. And so what we see actually when we look at this way is that we see three tendencies at once of the capitalist system. Capitalists in general are going to be incentivized to pay workers too little to allow for hoarding, because they don't want the workers to be hoarding. If the workers are hoarding their wages that they're given, then that's going to create blockages, and so they can't be allowed to do that. And one way to prevent them from doing that is to just pay them too little that they need to spend all of it immediately. There's two other kind of similar observations. You also need to find ways to condition them. You have to program their consumption habits. You have to, through advertising or through just hiring someone to train you how to spend your money correctly according to them, things like that. You hear all this talk about people are financially illiterate or this and that. What they're really talking about is that workers are consuming wrong, and it's creating problems. So you got to train them to consume your product, right? If you want to make sure that they're consuming a specific way, that's how you make capital flows work right. Then you have to train them to do that. You have to make sure, you have to condition their consumption so that they are always spending their wages immediately and on the stuff that they need upon receiving them. So, and then lastly, you want to make the intervals between wages as small as possible. You want to pay workers either by the day or by the week. You don't want to be paying them by the year. And the reason for that is simple. We've said already that capitalism hates long turnover times, and wages are variable capital, so they want it to turn over very, very quickly. And a part of that is that they also need the wages to be consumed as quickly as possible. And so I think that what we see today in especially in the media industries like video games and movies and stuff, is we see this general trend from hobbies that require a large amount of investment to kind of more rapid consumption of smaller things over time. Because if the media industry gets it so that people are consuming lots and lots of small things very, very quickly, then that's a much more consistent revenue stream than somebody going out to buy one big video game console. right? Buying one video game console, that, you know, that's a lot to expect of a worker. But if you just put something on a worker's phone that they can just kind of pull out, and they're always carrying around their phones anyway, you know, those microtransactions are another great example. I think that there's this push of people that are consuming media in the system to a lot of like very small, very quick consumption habits. And that's not simply a result of people desiring convenience. That is the desire of capital too. So all in all, you know, the conclusion here is that when I look at circulation 1, I see problems with the supply chain. When I look at circulation 2, I see overproduction and underconsumption problems. And now we finally reach the main topic, which is circulation 3, the interdepartmental circulation. Circulation 3 is something that we haven't really approached yet. Circulations 1 and 2 we kind of have been talking about on and off since the rate of profit video. This one is something that we haven't really said anything about yet. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by explaining what Marx did, and then we are going to build from there. So just like 1 and 2, what Marx is interested in is he's analyzing the inherent like vulnerabilities and tendencies and deficiencies implicit and latent to this circulation. And just like circulations 1 and 2, Marx is interested in approaching this question through an inspection of the question of what needs to go right in order for this circulation to go on unhindered. He goes about this by asking the question, what is necessary in order to maintain continual supply-demand equilibrium between the two departments? And then once he's identified those conditions, he can go about kind of asking the question, is it reasonable to expect these to be met? And then more interestingly and more importantly, if these conditions are met, what else, if anything, has to also be true? Which is a little bit of a different question than what we asked of the other two circulations. Or at the very least, I'm going to argue that he wanted to ask that question. And we're going to ask it ourselves. But in any case, that's the question he wants to ask, is what are the equilibrium conditions for this interdepartmental circulation? So in order to kind of think about those equilibrium conditions, he decides to begin with a capitalist system in which there's no accumulation going on. In other words, capitalists are consuming all of their surplus and they're not reinvesting. Now, this is obviously impossible because the coercive laws of competition force capitalists to continually reinvest or they get pushed out of their own industries. But he decides to start with this in order to more easily kind of point out and find equilibrium conditions so that he can kind of start to see what happens to them as he makes things start to accumulate and starts to look at the situation in which these loops are thickening. So I'm going to go through this part kind of quickly because we're going to come back to all of these concepts in much more careful detail when we get to what I'm going to be doing. So, but I think that I think I can explain it and make it clear without writing too much down. So what I have here is you know, the diagram again, the three circulations. And what I want to consider, and what we're going to be considering for the rest of the rest of this, is the total value output from each department, each period. I'm going to denote that Y1 and Y2. So Y1 is the total value output from Department 1. Y2 is the total value output from Department 2. Now, what I mean by that is that Department 1 is going to be putting out every production period a bunch of products, right? A bunch of commodities. If I just take the values of all those commodities and add them up, then what I have is Y1. I have the total value output of that department. Likewise, Y2, you know, each production period, Department 2 is putting out a whole bunch of consumer goods, and if I add up the values of all those consumer goods, then I get Y2. And just like everything else, we can break that into a constant and a variable and a surplus component. So Y1 can be broken down into a C1 and a V1 and an S1. So let's think about what these are one at a time. First of all, what's C1 here? C1 is the value of the raw materials. Remember, the way that we're breaking this down is that if I take a commodity and I look at its value, then that value has two components. One of those components is the value of the raw materials, and then there's the value of the labor that's added on, the amount of time that I add on to the amount of time that was already there in the form of the raw materials. That's the value. And so the value of the raw materials used to produce the capital goods, that's C1. But the raw materials are precisely what Department 1 is putting out. And so if Department 1 is making the raw materials, and C1 is the value of the raw materials used by Department 1, well then this circulation, the amount of value that is circulating here, is C1. That's exactly what this is. So this is C1. C1 is the value of the raw materials used by Department 1. Circulation 1 is the circulation of the raw materials the Department 1 is making for its own sake. Now, if C1 is what's circulating through, if the amount of value that's circulating in circulation 1 is C1, then the rest of it has to be leaving, because there's only two arrows leaving Department 1. There's the arrow that comes back, and then there's the arrow that leaves. And if we want, to account for all of the value that's being put out, and we do, because we're kind of imagining a simple reproduction situation in which, everything is produced and consumed each period. And so then in that case, the rest of it has to be leaving. And so what we have is that this line here is V1 plus S1. So if we look at the total value produced by Department 1, then C1, that part of it, is what's circulating in circulation 1, and then the rest is leaving and is a part of circulation 3. Now, if we consider circulation 2, the circulation of commodity, the circulation of consumer goods that are being consumed by the consumer goods industry, then we can kind of see a similar argument. Let's forget C2 for a while and just consider V2 and S2. Well, first of all, V2, that's the variable capital, right? This is the commodities that are this is the value of all of the wage goods, specifically all of the wage goods that are consumed by workers in Department 2. And so so V2 is a part of what's circulating here. So V2 is part of this circulation. S2 is another part, because if we're assuming simple reproduction, and part of that assumption is that the capitalists are not reinvesting anything, and so if they're not reinvesting anything, then they have to be consuming everything. So in other words, the capitalists from Department 2 are going to be consuming all of their surplus. And of course, if they're consuming all of their surplus, then they are consuming their surplus in consumer goods, because they're not using the capital goods. So if the capitalists in Department 2 are consuming only their surplus, then they have to be consuming commodities that they make. And so V2 plus S2 is this circulation. And so by the exact same argument, if we're assuming that everything is being consumed each period, and we're in perfect supply-demand equilibrium all the time, every period you make exactly what everybody needs, and then it gets consumed, and then you repeat the process, then if V2 plus S2 is the amount of value that's circulating within Department 2, then the rest of it, that is to say C2, needs to be the amount of value that is leaving Department 2. And so what we have here is we've accounted for everything. All six of these numbers are somewhere. And what we have now is the equilibrium condition that we were looking for. If this is all to work out correctly, then what has to be the case is that the two rest of it have to equal each other. V1 plus S1 has to equal C2. And so for things to remain in perpetual equilibrium, we must have the condition that V1 plus S1 equals C2. That's the condition. And so this is something that has to be true to maintain supply-demand equilibrium, even if the economy is growing. If the economy is to grow and maintain perpetual equilibrium, then this has to be true at all times. You always have to have it be the case that the amount of money that capitalists are spending on consumer goods is the exact same amount of money that the consumer goods industries are spending to buy raw materials. Those two things have to equal out in order for this to work out. And so that's what Marx basically derives as like his big conclusion for simple reproduction. And it's also something that applies to extended reproduction. It's just something that's going to be changing. The numbers here are going to be changing, but they have to be equal to each other. And so that's kind of Marx's first step. So with the clarity of simple reproduction, Marx is able to basically derive for himself the equilibrium condition that needs to be true even in a situation when the economy is growing. And then so what he turns to is a situation in which the economy is growing, in which capitalists are reinvesting their surplus and capital is accumulating. That's what and this is the situation that he calls expanded reproduction. And he's still interested in maintaining perpetual supply-demand equilibrium because he's looking for the conditions for stability in order to kind of analyze the viability of it. And so what he does next is he works out a numerical example for an expanding economy. And the way that he does it is peculiar. So in his example, and I'm not going to just yet go through his numerical example in any detail. I'm not going to show you any of the numbers. I'm just going to kind of talk about it in English and explain what he does. And then after we've improved upon it, then we'll return and we'll look at what he did and we'll compare. And the reason I want to do it that way is because I think by that point we'll be like much better equipped conceptually to really look at what he did and kind of see it for what it is. So in his example, what he has going on is that he starts out with some amount of value from the two departments, and some of that value is surplus. And what he basically has happening is that capitalists for Department 1 are each period reinvesting a fixed percentage of that surplus. In his example, it's half. So capitalists in Department 1 are taking half of their surplus value each period, and they're reinvesting it into production to accumulate. And then what he does is he has basically capitalists in Department 2 reinvesting differently. He has capitalists in Department 2 reacting to the investment decisions of the capitalists in Department 1, and they're just reinvesting whatever is necessary to maintain his equilibrium condition that he derived in the case of simple reproduction. So in other words, if an expanding capital goods department requires some amount more consumption goods for the new workers, right? If I'm reinvesting my capital in my surplus, then that's going to involve hiring new workers. Those new workers I need to hire are going to require more wage goods, and so that requires the consumer goods industry to expand. But how much does it need to expand? It's some amount, right? And so basically what he has is he just has the capitalists in the consumer goods industry magically choosing to reinvest the perfect amount to make the equilibrium continue. And so what he ends up creating is a moving equilibrium, i.e. conditions for equilibrium that Department 2 is for some reason kind of enslaved to meet, and those conditions are changing from period to period, and so basically he demonstrates kind of a moving set of equilibrium conditions from period to period. Now, that's what he does. Now, at this point, what we have to remember is that Capital Volume 2 is an unfinished work. He never finished it. He died before it finished, and then Engels cleaned it up as much as he could and put it out. And so, Marx tries to take away some overall things from his numerical examples that he works out. The things he takes away is basically that, we have this moving equilibrium that's very specific, and there's no good reason to expect the capitalists acting on their own are going to meet the conditions for this equilibrium. And that's a valuable observation to make, and it's correct. Another thing he talks a lot about is the credit system. He talks about how the credit system is probably going to accumulate a lot of power for a lot of reasons. And a lot of these reasons we've already given, either implicitly or explicitly. One of the major reasons is that we mentioned in the last video that finance capital has kind of an implicit mobility advantage over the other two. So the finance capitalists will have an advantage in that sense. Especially during a crisis, the financial capitalists will be able to kind of consolidate power. They're probably going to be the main drivers of centralization. That's something he talks about a lot about in Volume 1. Another reason is that, we mentioned that as accumulation happens, the amount of money that's in circulation has to grow, as well as the reserve hoard of money to kind of act and to kind of control the money supply and keep the money signal stable. And so the bank has to basically accumulate money at that point. The credit system has to grow. And then maybe the biggest reason of all is that we mentioned that, as more and more capitalists move to make use of their idle capital that they have to keep basically on reserve as they wait for their turnovers to finish, we mentioned that the credit system becomes the common capital of the class. And as the common capital of the class, there needs to be a kind of a managerial class of capitalists that is nearby this kind of common capital that is making sure that it's going places that are profitable. And so you've already basically got this sort of coordinating cabal of capitalists sort of at the top that are making sure that things are kind of optimally profitable. And he speculates that this grouping of capitalists, of finance capitalists that are managing the common capital of the class might kind of over time take on the role of coordinator to avoid the kinds of possible issues and disruptions that he's observing here. And then finally, another thing he does a lot of is, or not a lot of, just a little bit, as a treat, he kind of does some speculating about what these problems would kind of translate to or change into in like a socialist economy. He says things along the lines of like, in a socialized economies, workers would have to do this or that in order to avoid this or that. And so we'll talk more about those implications at the end once we've kind of improved on his results and seen something more concrete with them. So I think we can be pretty sure here that Marx was not fully satisfied with his own approach, and there's a few reasons why, but the main thing that's at issue here is his investment scheme. Capitalists in Department 2 are slaves of the capitalists in Department 1. They have no agency of their own. They have to basically just reinvest according to what capitalists in Department 1 do first. And an implication of this that we'll see when we look more closely at his numerical example is that capitalists in Department 2 are reinvesting at a different rate than capitalists in Department 1. Capitalists in Department 1 are reinvesting half their surplus. It's generally going to turn out to be the case that capitalists in Department 2 are reinvesting at a completely different rate, which is very strange because, most capitalists are probably going to have capital invested in the capital goods department and the wage goods department. And so basically what you're saying at that point is that you've got capitalists that are just choosing to reinvest in different proportions in the two industries, which is just kind of, it makes no sense. Why would they be doing that? You should expect, and then another kind of implication of that is that if the rates of reinvestment are different, then it's pretty much functionally the case that only capital in Department 1 can be reinvested in Department 1. And capital in Department 2 is also likewise stuck in Department 2. If you keep the same rate of reinvestment for both departments, then you can think about capital being kind of reallocated from one department to another. But if you're keeping the rate of reinvestment separate, then you've kind of separated the two departments from one another. But all in all, I mean, the issue at hand is that this is just a completely unrealistic, unreasonable, not even unrealistic. I should go further and say this is an unreasonable assumption about how the capitalist class is going to choose to reinvest and behave. It also isn't the original thing that he chose to assume about how the capitalist class was behaving. In the beginning of the same section that he does this, he actually starts out saying that all capitalists are going to reinvest half their surplus value, not just the ones in Department 1. He assumes that all of them are going to, and then he just doesn't proceed like that. He says it, but then he doesn't proceed in that way. So he obviously didn't have in mind what he ended up doing. So, I mean, it seems like what happened is that he wanted to analyze equilibrium under a more kind of realistic assumption about how the capitalist class was likely to behave on a whole, acting in their individual class interests, and then found that too mathematically difficult for him, and admittedly it would have been. And then he decided to come up with a simpler investment scheme from which he could more easily derive equilibrium conditions and then analyze that equilibrium. And so the question that we need to ask before we propose kind of doing it the original way he wanted to do it is we need to ask the question, does it even matter, right? If he's just trying to analyze equilibrium, well, he found a moving equilibrium and he analyzed it. So what could doing this in a more kind of, in a less, what would a more reasonable investment scheme actually give us? Do we really need to go that far? And to answer that question, we really need to think a little bit harder about what it is that Marx is actually trying to do overall in the volumes of Capital. And at this point, we have to address the subtitle. The subtitle is Critique of Political Economy. The political economists of Marx's time were basically utopians. They were the kinds of people that would basically say, look at the problems of their society and say, that problem there is because you haven't done capitalism hard enough yet. You don't have, like, it's the same thing you hear a lot today, right? Whenever occasionally you'll hear some, like, anarcho-capitalist or something say on Twitter, like, the problems of our society are actually too much socialism and you need a purer capitalism. And the problems of our society are because you don't have a pure enough capitalism. If you just made markets freer and you got rid of government more or this and that, but in some sense, if you put together some kind of pure capitalist society, then things would flourish for everybody. That's the kind of these are the kind of people that are doing economics in Marx's time. And Marx is attempting to form a critique of those people. Implicit to doing that, not implicit, explicit. He says he's going to do this in the very beginning of Volume 1. What he's really trying to do is he's basically taking their desired economy as a given. He's saying, okay, you want a pure capitalist society? Let's assume we have one. And then let's proceed from there to look at it. And I'm going to show you guys that this society of yours isn't going to work as well as you think it will. It's not going to lead to everybody a rising standard of living. It's not going to do this and that. It's not going to do these things that you think it's going to do. In fact, everything is going to get worse for everybody, and it's going to show itself to be deeply unstable. That's Marx's goal in Capital's volumes 1 through 3. He's going to set up what they define as a pure capitalist society. He's going to subscribe to their terms and conditions, and then he's going to show them that by their own logic, the society that they want is not what's good for people. That's what he's trying to do. And so what Marx is trying to do specifically at this current point in Capital is he's trying to investigate the question, what does equilibrium look like in a perfect capitalist society? Let's suppose that we have exactly what the perfect capitalist society would be like from the perspective of these political economists. That is to say, a society in which nature doesn't put up any problems, there's always labor available to hire, you have perfect supply-demand equilibrium, there's an equilibrium rate of profit across industries, there's no landlord class leeching profits or like despotic kings or anything. He wants to look at their definition of a perfect capitalist society, and he wants to basically say, once you have all these things going on, is it really all that perfect? Are there knock-on effects? Are there consequences? He basically wants to look at their perfect society and analyze what else has to be true about the society that is behaving that way. What are the conditions for this, and what are the results of those conditions? How is a society likely to develop if you hold these things constant, if you hold this capitalist society to be perfect in the way that that these political economists want it to be perfect? And so that's the question he wants to ask. He wants to ask the question, what does equilibrium growth look like in a perfect capitalist society? Where perfect is their definition of perfect. Now that's what he's trying to do. And so as soon as I say that, there's an objection I think that people might have towards the criticism that I'm leveling at Marx regarding his investment schema. I think that it's probably likely that a lot of people have said or would say to me that it doesn't really matter that his model isn't realistic, or that it's even downright unreasonable. It doesn't really matter that the investment schema is nonsense, because he's not trying to create like a predictive model. He's not trying to create like a model. He's just trying to analyze the equilibrium conditions. And since he's just trying to analyze equilibrium conditions, it doesn't really matter if his model is actually like modeling a realistic capitalist society. And they're right that all he's trying to do is analyze equilibrium, but they're wrong that you don't need a predictive and realistic model to properly do that. Because there's a question of what equilibrium are you talking about? Because in a capitalist society where things aren't growing, there is only one equilibrium condition. You just need these two departments to communicate in this way. But when you say a capitalist economy is growing, what does that mean? It can grow in a lot of ways. You can have the growth go in multiple directions. You have these two departments. Where is the reinvestment going? Is it going here or is it going here? And so you have to basically describe a reinvestment strategy, and for every reinvestment strategy you define, you're going to get a different moving equilibrium. So Marx picks a particular reinvestment scheme, and that creates a specific moving equilibrium. But if you come up with a different behavioral, if you assume something different about how the capitalist class is going to behave, then you're going to get a different set of equilibrium conditions. And a different set of equilibrium conditions is going to produce a different set of conclusions about what a natural equilibrium in a pure capitalist society looks like. You're just going to get a different looking society when you do that. And so this question arises of which equilibrium is the one that we actually want to analyze? And the answer, of course, is we want the most realistic one. And so at that point, we've concluded that the only way to properly analyze what equilibrium growth looks like in a pure and natural capitalist society is you have to model the actual natural behavior of the people within it. In other words, you need a model. You need a predictive model. You cannot address the question of what does equilibrium look like without one, because otherwise what that equilibrium actually is ambiguous. And I should clarify that what I mean when I say predictive model is that you need a model based on a prediction of how the capitalist class is going to realistically, naturally want to behave. Not necessarily that it's predictive of what's going to happen in our reality. The ability to use it for that reason would only be secondhand at that point. That's not to say that you can't use it to to conclude things about what's likely to happen in our reality. But that's also not what I mean by predictive. That would only be kind of a secondhand effect. And again, I wanted to reiterate that Marx had the right idea from the very beginning. The natural behavior of the capitalist class as a whole is that they will want to reinvest a fixed proportion of their surplus value each period into accumulation. That's what they're going to do. They're all going to do it individually. I might invest 6%, you might invest 7%, the other guy might invest 20%, but overall, at the end of the day, a certain amount of the total surplus in each department has been reinvested, and it's probably going to be similar for each one. And so that's what he started with, and that's not what he finished with. And so he clearly had the right idea. He just didn't have the mathematical tools that he needed and the mathematical training that he needed to properly work out the details of his question, which was posed correctly. He needed to be able to write down a system of difference equations and solve them. And even if he had been able to write down the equations, which who knows, he might have written them down, he might not have, I'm not sure. If I had to guess, I'd kind of doubt it, because it doesn't even seem like he's completely aware that his schema has capitalists reinvesting at separate rates. But even if he did manage to write the equations down in the way that you need to, he definitely would not have been able to solve them. But the interesting thing is that despite not being able to write down the equations and crank out the actual math, he was able to formulate the problem correctly. He did pose the correct question. I think the question is this: how can it be the case that a fixed percentage of the surplus value gets reinvested each period, while at the same time having it be the case that every single period exactly what is needed to do that growth is always available? That's the question that I think Marx was trying to pose and answer, and he did his best. But here's the thing. If you manage to actually take that problem stated in English and write it down in math, then you do have something that can be solved. And when you solve it, you end up with a set of growth paths that are truly startling. And I think if you manage to get that done, and if you manage to see those growth paths, he would have found himself with a punchline to Volume 2, which is every bit as impactful as the punchiest parts of Volumes 1 through 3. He would have ended up with a huge conclusion that was as memorable as the general law of accumulation, which is what I'm saving for last, because it's the biggest, it's I think the most dramatic result of all of his stuff. I think he would have ended up with a general refutation of just the loudest possible proponents of a purer capitalism that you could possibly find. And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go through the process of showing you how to write down the formula so that you can see exactly what the problem is that we're trying to solve mathematically. And I'm not going to show you the solution, although you can find it. I have it written down, and I'll show you where you can look at it if you want to see it, if you're feeling brave. But what I've done is, once we have the equations written down, I've gone through the trouble of solving them, and I've also put together a way to visualize the solutions and also see a whole bunch of other stuff at the same time. Once you actually end up with this growth path, the thing is, you have a model of a capitalist economy. And you can look at every single other idea, basically, that he comes up with throughout the 3 volumes in that context. You can actually just look at all of it. And I should probably say at this point that what's coming is going to be fairly mathy, but I want to assure you that I am working towards a punchline. I'm working towards conclusions that I can say out loud in English. So even if your eyes glaze over while you're looking at some of the math that I'm doing, if that doesn't do it for you, just keep listening, and I'll always kind of say out loud what the important takeaways in English are, as I get to them. So don't feel like just because you get confused by one of the steps here or there in the math I'm about to do, or just kind of zone out because it's boring. Don't feel like you're going to miss out if you do that necessarily. I mean, you should try to see through it, because I'm showing it to you because I think it's valuable. But at the same time, don't worry too much, because there's always going to be conclusions to say out loud in English at the end of everything that I'm going to be doing from here on out. So now that we've stated the problem, I think I'm going to cut the video off and continue it basically break this into 2 parts, because it's really long. In the next video, we will work out the math. That takes about an hour, and then we will talk about the results, which is about an hour and 20 minutes. I'm not sure if I'm going to split those into 2 videos or not. If I leave the math its own video, nobody's going to watch it. So I'm not sure what I'll do, but so you're either going to see 3 videos at once or 2.